And you're live.
All right. Good evening, everyone. I'm Kanik Aguirre, Chair of the NVTC Legislative and Policy Committee. Welcome to our November 21st joint meeting with the NVTC WMATA Committee, and we are starting at 6:02 p.m. Tonight's meeting is an all-virtual public meeting as permitted under the Virginia Freedom of Information Act and NVTC's electronic participation policy. The meeting is being streamed live via NVTC's YouTube account. NVTC staff follow the procedures and guidelines to give notice to WMATA committee members, legislative and policy committee members, commissioners, staff, and the public about this meeting. For the public, if the live stream transmission fails, please contact NVTC staff via email at support@novatransit.org, which will be monitored during the entire meeting. This information can also be found on NVTC's meeting webpage. I will now ask Mr. Duvetter to call the roll to identify commissioners and staff present on the call.
All right, Commissioner Snyder.
Here.
Commissioner Waukesha.
Here.
Commissioner Alcorn.
Here.
Commissioner Letourneau.
Here.
Commissioner Aguirre.
Here.
And Commissioner Reed.
Here.
We are expecting a few more, I think at least one more for sure. As far as staff, I'm Andrew Duvetter, our Director of Policy and Programs. We have Executive Director Kate Mattice, NVTC Program Manager, WMATA Program Manager Adam Hager. We have Administrative Specialist Tinley O'Hara with us, our Commuter Choice and Policy Program Manager Daniel Nickelbein, and then our Transit Technology Program Manager Ian Rain, and of course Melissa Walker, our IT and Web Manager, who makes all of this possible. And we do have a quorum for both committees. And at this point, back to you, Mr. Chair, for the meeting summary.
Awesome. Thank you, Mr. Duvetter. We have a lot to discuss, so we're going to go ahead and jump right into it. So on September 19th, we have our joint committee meeting summary in your meeting materials. Do any committee members have any changes, comments on those? Not seeing any hands or expressions otherwise, we're going to go ahead and accept those. And now I'd like to hand it over to my co-conductor for tonight, NVTC WMATA Committee Chair, Mr. Walter Alcorn.
All right, thank you, Kanik. So our next topic is going to be familiar to many of you. It's a standing agenda item for our joint committee meetings. It's one we've been talking about for some time. Long-term, sustainable, dedicated funding for public transit in Northern Virginia. So as I think we all are aware, there are several efforts underway, and NVTC plays a very critical role. So we're going to hear tonight from Andrew, who's going to give us a brief update on DMV moves and SJ28 and the final steps for NVTC's 2024 annual report on the performance and condition of WMATA. And this, of course, all feeds into NVTC's legislative agenda, which Chair Gary will be providing an update in a few minutes on that. So, Andrew, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, I have to remember where unmute is.
There we go. All right, good.
Thank you, Chair Alcorn. So just a very brief reminder for everyone, NVTC is at the center and at the table of a number of regional and Virginia-focused conversations. Much of the work that we've been doing to date through the annual report, our Value of Transit to the Commonwealth, and our Metro Operating Funding and Reform Working Group report last year are integral to and foundational to these efforts. So DMV moves, obviously, is the regional one. It is looking at a number of coordination and sort of customer seamlessness recommendations, as well as looking at mostly WMATA, but all transit funding in the region. SJ28, the Northern Virginia Growing Needs of Public Transit Joint Subcommittee. It's a subcommittee of the General Assembly. We're providing a great deal of technical support. I'm the chair of the technical working group. Senator Evan is the chair of the subcommittee. That group is tasked with looking at additional revenues and eventually coming up with potential recommendations next year. So let's go ahead and jump to the next slide. As far as DMV moves, this is a brief update. There has not been a task force meeting since we last met at the November Commission meeting. We do intend on providing a much more significant update at the December commission meeting, because the next task force meeting of DMV Moves is on December 2nd. So we'll certainly help our commissioners who are on that panel prepare, and we'll report out what happens in December. And I see as well, Mr. Smedberg is joining us as well. Just as a brief reminder, at the task force last meeting, they took a look at some initial recommendations and funding scenarios, had a lot more information on WMATA's looming capital funding cliff, and looked at a qualitative list of revenues that look quite familiar to us as we have been having these detailed conversations. What's new is that advisory groups have just started meeting to kind of put some teeth on those recommendations, and that's kind of a 6-month to a year process, depending on which of the various recommendations kind of categories you see there. So not too much of an update here from us, just because we're in the middle of meetings, but we expect to have a much more robust conversation and update for the commission at our December meeting. So that's all I have on DMV Moves. Mr. Smedberg, I know you just joined. You're welcome to add, but we can also move on to the SJ28 items, since there's not too much of an update here. But I did want to just offer you the opportunity if you had anything you wanted to convey.
Yeah, no, thank you, Andrew. That was a good summary. Sorry, I was on the call with Clark Mercer, and we were talking about our next DMV Moves meeting, but what you covered tonight is perfect for right now. So,
all right, thank you.
Yep.
Jump to SJ28, which we did have a meeting since the last commission meeting, so there's an update from this. That meeting was on November 12th. It was the final meeting of 2024, and there's going to be 4 more in 2025. So the outcomes of that meeting are that, in addition to the 10 revenue sources that NVTC, through its Metro Funding and Reform Working Group report last year, looked at, there's an additional 5 that will sort of be added to the expanded list to evaluate. So those 5 are listed here. There are regional highway use fee, which is essentially additional fee paid at the time of vehicle registration for either battery electric vehicles or sort of hybrids. Basically, this concept would be to look at the state highway use fee, which exists for those vehicles and is in sort of complement to the state gas tax. And we have a regional gas tax. We don't have a regional highway use fee complement to help supplement the regional gas tax as a transportation revenue source when sort of we have a lot of changing vehicle types that can impact that, how well that functions as a revenue source. So that's kind of one concept. The next would be to look at evaluating the revenue estimates for a regional income tax, which is pretty straightforward. And then the third here is looking at a retail delivery fee. So there are basically 2 examples of this in other states, and it is a pretty nominal fee on the delivery of sort of retail goods that one orders online. The fourth is I-66 tolling inside the Beltway. So this would be to get a revenue estimate from VDOT on what it would take to look at additional hours of tolling on I-66 and the other direction, right? So the off-peak direction. There's obviously a lot of potential legal and constitutional issues with tolling in Virginia, but this is something that we could get a revenue estimate on from our colleagues at VDOT. And then the last is the regional motor vehicle rental tax. So this was the idea here was to look at a tourism-based fee or tax. And so the motor vehicle rental tax was something that fit that category. So the basic plan here, and as we move forward, and the commission did authorize moving forward to obtain consultant services last month, is that the technical working group will provide the SJ28 subcommittee with an expanded list of revenue options. So these 5 plus the 10 that were looked at last year would be come back with revenue estimates both at the NVTC, the PRTC, and at the statewide level where possible. So it is to come back with a wealth of technical information so that the SJ28 subcommittee can evaluate those and look at agency needs, and then eventually they can make recommendations later next year. So that's kind of the broad path forward. I've put we have a link to the SJ28 website. There's a lengthy work plan, and you can kind of see the cadence of the meetings that are planned for next year. broadly speaking, we'll do our best to sort of integrate feedback from the commission and this joint committee at key times. So we'll be developing that schedule the best we can as we move into next year. So that's a bit of an update there, but we had, I think, a good meeting. We know there was a lot of conversation from those on the committee about property taxes and some value capture options. So I know Senator Servell asked the technical working group to kind of come up with what it would take to study some of those options further, either a tax or fee per parking spot, or different value capture options around metro rail stations, which would be primarily supplemental sales, or excuse me, property tax. So it's pretty robust discussion on that. That conversation is ongoing, but we did want to just give that update and let the joint committee know the work of SJ28 and where that currently sits. We go to next slide.
And Andrew, before we go to the next slide, let me just.
So that concludes my report, and certainly, Mr. Alcorn, as a member of that subcommittee, I'll hand it back to you.
Yeah, no, thank you. It was a very good, concise summary. Just for my colleagues, there was a fair amount of discussion about various real estate taxation options, and I did push back on those. And my point was, we already have the real estate as an option. We're using the real estate tax right now. Special tax districts have been used around some metro stations in Virginia, but not others, to fund the capital improvements. So there are a lot of, I think, reasons that real estate-based taxation doesn't really make sense here. And there was a lively discussion, I would say, about that. Mr. Schneider, I saw your hand first. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I know we shouldn't take any of these off the table, and I don't, but I will say that the proposal for tolling inside the Beltway would violate a number of agreements that were made to allow the tolling that occurs now. And so that would be met, I think, with a fair amount of skepticism from a fair number of players, especially the additional diversion of traffic off 66 into neighborhood streets, which is already occurring. So let me just say that I think that one's not going to receive very favorable view by the jurisdictions that are most directly affected by it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schneider. Mr. Waukesha.
Yeah, thank you. Just wanted to ask about the regional highway use fee. And I think Kate has mentioned this before, but am I correct in understanding, those of us who pay that highway use fee based on the number of miles driven in an EV or fuel efficient vehicle, that rate is based only on the statewide fuel tax that doesn't include any of the Northern Virginia specific surcharges or additional gas tax elements of the gas tax that folks pay in Northern Virginia? And what is that delta?
So I'll try to break this into pieces because there's a lot of overlapping topics, but I think the way to think about the regional highway use fee is that let's start with the statewide regional highway use fee. So it's meant to be a sort of complement to the statewide gas tax. It varies based upon the fuel efficiency of a vehicle. It is meant to be about 85% of what one would have paid if they were in a less fuel efficient vehicle paying lots of fuel taxes. So it is meant to be a little less than what it would have been. And then there's kind of a gradated scale. There's a calculation, things like that. I think that the concept here is that in the 2020 transportation bill.
Andrew, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but it's meant to be 85% of what one would pay of the statewide fuel tax or 85% of what a Northern Virginian would pay given
Apply the current statewide highway use fee only applies to the current statewide gas tax.
and that's where the 85% of that. So apples to apples comparing to another Northern Virginian, it's much less than 85%.
Well, so there are a couple things to add here. It is based on the average rate that Virginians drive, and that gets updated kind of every year.
Yeah.
If one drives less, one can voluntarily apply to be in a mileage-based user fee
Yes.
program, and then you can pay less.
Yeah,
But-
I'm in it. I'm
Okay,
in that.
yeah.
I'm in that category. I'm
Yeah.
just trying to understand. Is it so? It sounds like it does not really include at all the Northern Virginia specific additional gas tax.
Correct.
Is
Correct.
okay.
Correct. So the concept that staff would put forward would be essentially tacking on the regional version of that. So it would be additional and keep it roughly proportional. Obviously, that's a General Assembly decision. This is just for coming up with revenue estimates. I think
Yeah.
the big picture is more than half. I think it's about over 50% of EVs and sort of hybrid EVs in the Commonwealth are from NVTC jurisdictions.
Right.
So looking at the long-term regional gas tax, which funds VRE, funds WMATA, it doesn't have the same sort of long-term stability that the highway provides the state gas tax. The other thing to note is that there are potential legislative partners on this because everywhere in Virginia now has a regional gas tax. So that's new from 2020.
Yeah. Okay.
So
Thank you.
that's kind of my attempt at a concise summary.
One other note I'll add, and this is on one of the original 10 possible funding sources. The note that for any sort of a regional income tax, that should be analyzed as potentially, not exclusively, but potentially taking some of the existing real estate tax that we pay the state and applying it to transit in the region. So, looking at it from that way as well. So, any other questions or comments on the SJ 28?
Hey, Walter. I feel compelled to mildly counter my friend Mr. Snyder with this. I know there will be politically unpopular decisions as a result of all of this. A sales tax will also be politically unpopular, but I think everything should be on the table, including the 66 stuff, because the drivers there are not Virginia drivers for the most part. So, the inbound is Virginia drivers, and I can tell you that the reverse direction has much worse congestion. So even from straight up traffic management, something needs to be done because that road is not passable right now. So higher powers than all of us will debate these things, but let's keep the conversation moving on all this stuff. And if that's a revenue source that could buy down what the jurisdictions have to contribute ultimately, then it should be on the table.
All right, thank you, Matt. Kate, I see your hand up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just for context, and this is really for the sort of the listening public, is just a reminder, while SJ 28, our staff at NVTC have a role, we have obviously members of NVTC on SJ 28. That is an independent group that is put up by and put together by the legislature. And so the commission at the right time can be putting forth whether we support, endorse or what have you. It does get a little confusing because we are providing some technical support to SJ 28, but SJ 28 is independent from NVTC as an organization. So when Andrew was talking about the list of revenues, just for full, NVTC has not endorsed any of these 5 additionals. We happen to have mentioned the last 10 at staff level, but obviously there will be a role for the commission to be playing in feedback to SJ 28 before they have any major recommendations next year.
Yeah, thank you, Kate. And And I have to say, when this before this got going and when we were planning on this in the future, I think for both this and for DMV moves, we had a lot of discussion in these committees about the role that this joint committee would play. And I feel good. I appreciate the robust discussion, and immediate feedback that we get for some of these ideas. I think as we get further into when it starts to get a little more real, then we'll probably need to schedule maybe even a little more longer time for discussion, so that we could go back, and make solid recommendations as a commission. So, any other questions, comments on SJ 28? And Andrew, did you have any more slides, or was that it?
I think at this point we have simply a very brief process update on the annual report, and then
Please.
I think it's the funding principles after that. Okay, yeah. So we had a good discussion at the November commission meeting on the draft NVCC 2024 annual report on the performance and condition of WMATA recommendations. So at this point, where staff are currently at, or we are making some minor technical edits, integrating some small comments, and providing additional context to the significant steps that were taken by the Metro Board today to adopt a new bus network and new rail and bus formulas, which touch a number of recommendations that are in the 2024 report. So NVTC staff are making some very quick edits to respond to those current events, make sure it's a timely report. Otherwise, the report is pretty much as you saw it in its draft form, and it will be an action item for the December commission meeting, and we get it packaged and sent off to the right people by the deadline. So this is meant to be a quick process update. That's all I have, and certainly happy to hand it back to the chair.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Any questions, comments on that? Okay, all right, then let's jump in from the frying pan into the fire, so to speak. Funding principles discussion. So we do have the next step in our discussions about funding long-term dedicated sustainable transit funding. And what we need to talk about here is funding principles. These are going to be brought to the commission in December for adoption. So Andrew, go ahead and take it back for some framing remarks. And for this item, before Adam, he's going to walk us through a draft of the principles and show how they tie into efforts, both SJ 28 and DMV moves. So Andrew, take it away, and then
absolutely. So actually, let's go to the next slide, and then I will turn to Kate for some framing comments, and then we'll turn to Adam. So for this slide, what I want to do is just remind everyone of the background of why we're here, because this funding resolution bullet points that you'll see and principles relate to some of the information that's on the screen here. So just big picture, Northern Virginia faces a number of transit fiscal cliffs, both capital and operating. The region was successful, thanks to the help of the Virginia General Assembly and other partners in DC and Maryland, in providing 2 years of additional operating subsidies to help close that gap. So from a Virginia perspective, we're in good shape for fiscal 25 and 26. And I think we face a lot of challenges on additional funding in fiscal 27 on WMATA's operating budget. In terms of WMATA's capital budget, some of the tools that were used to help close the gap did accelerate the capital cliff. That is currently anticipated in fiscal 2028. And so what that means is at that point, WMATA's dedicated capital bonding will reach its capacity, and then the capital program will have to start to decline. And it's important to note that even though that looks like a cliff starting in a certain fiscal year, WMATA is already feeling impacts of this constrained capital environment now. In terms of VRE, VRE is anticipating that they will have an operating budget shortfall projected starting in fiscal 2028. VRE does have a couple years left of additional pandemic aid, but that starts to become extremely challenging starting in 28 and beyond. For our colleagues at OmniRide in PRTC, They already exhausted their federal aid and confronted a cliff starting in fiscal 25, and this will recur every year until there is a solution. And then lastly, for our local transit agencies, which I should add, this is shared across the states. This is not just a Northern Virginia local transit agency conversation. This is an all transit agencies in Virginia conversation. Some of the state aid, some of the merit funding will start to decline into levels that are prescribed by code. There were some one-time increases, and so that decline will start in fiscal 26, and we'll start to see some gaps statewide. DRPT has articulated this in its TISDAC process, which we're following closely. But there is obviously a link here between both Northern Virginia needs as well as statewide transit needs. So that's the context that is before us. And at this point, I will ask Kate to kind of give a little additional framing before Adam jumps into the idea of a resolution and some principles on funding.
Thank you, Andrew. And indeed, what we're really seeking a good conversation this evening, and hopefully moving forward to the commission, is to put together a resolution from the commission that identifies the priorities, right? And that's what, as we go through these discussions, we found this historically to be really important, that NVTC sort of lays down the things that are very important to it as we get into things. We actually use this, I think, very successfully in a lot of the negotiations that led up to the dedicated capital funding, especially when it came to things like governance structures and changes that found their way into legislation. And so again, this is an approach was adding on top of our annual report and as well as our legislative agenda is actually having a resolution that would articulate NVTC's really what the commission's principles are for this funding discussion as we move forward. And so based upon, we're going to dive into that conversation, but it's really to see that could be put into a resolution form for consideration at the December meeting.
Well, thanks, Kate. I will jump in now. If we could go to the next slide. So I've got a little bit of context. I've got some considerations, and then we'll take a look at the principles that are, of course, draft at this point, and we are eager to hear your discussion. So again, just a couple slides here to tee up some discussion on the draft principles for long-term sustainable transit funding. So as we know, both DMV Moves and SJ28 are developing proposals on the structure and mechanics of possible funding solutions as we move into 2025. So the commission has a really good opportunity at this point, really to put a marker down with these principles. So a couple things to note up front. Most of these concepts are not really new. They've been mentioned in various forums over the last year. So we're looking to put them here in one place and again, get your input and feedback this evening. Next slide, please. Again, some things to think about before we get to the draft set of principles. One is just the scale of the need. So DMV Moves has shared that maintaining the existing regional transit network would cost at least an additional $818 million per year in the FY 26 to 35 timeframe. So again, that is a big need that we're talking about here. Another consideration is that many commissioners have shared concerns about the impact on local property taxpayers. And then there is, of course, a system in place for existing transit revenue, the sources and sort of how they flow to each agency. So it's important to be mindful of that as part of this discussion. And then we've covered some of the limitations of a one-size-fits-all approach, namely the fact that different jurisdictions have different priorities and will generate different amounts of revenue to support transit. And then finally here, there are several key differences in funding WMATA and other Northern Virginia agencies, most of which come from, of course, the fact that WMATA is part of an interstate compact. So it's, again, important there to be mindful of those differences. So next slide. And moving now into the principles. So the first 5 here are for all transit agencies in Northern Virginia, while the 4 on the next slide are for funding WMATA. First, 2 of our key ideas have been the concepts of long-term and sustainable. So this isn't a process that we want to go through every few years, and we want to make sure that any new revenues allow for growth via indexing or otherwise. Second is to maintain existing revenue streams that support transit. We don't want to pull from existing sources for these new needs that we're outlining. Third, again, we want to be mindful of potential impacts on property owners in Northern Virginia. The fourth item here is really focused on a diversity of sources to support future transit needs. So we don't want to be over-reliant on just one source as we have this conversation. And then lastly here on this slide is the concept of distributing revenues to MVTC for allocation to all of our agencies, similar to how our current trust fund model operates. Next slide, please. So now looking at some draft principles for funding WMATA. First is the basic concept that the three funding jurisdictions, so Virginia, Maryland, and the district, come up with their own funding solutions that meet their own needs. The second item here speaks to the idea that revenues generated for public transit purposes in the MVTC district that exceed what's needed to support the WMATA bill be used for other transit systems. Third is maintaining the joint partnership between Northern Virginia and the Commonwealth and funding WMATA. And fourth and finally is getting at the concept of dedicated funding, which of course WMATA would need protected by code and bondable to support their capital program's future needs. So again, we look forward to your input on these draft principles, and we're happy to take any questions as well.
Adam, thank you very much. Thank you, Kate. Andrew, this is a great jumping off point for discussion. I have a couple of thoughts, and then I'll open it up to my colleagues. First of all, I think this is a good way of funding framing the funding principles. I think we might want to include as part of this in some way, or at least explicitly, have some principle relating to cost control of the systems. I realize that's not funding, but I think, to pair funding principles, I think the jumping off point is that we're funding systems that are practicing cost management, cost control in a reasonable way. So I'd like to see somehow that worked in, if not explicitly into here, something that's closely paired with it. And I know that's sort of the way DMV moves is pushing right now as well. The second thought is back on slide 13, the previous slide. I do want to make sure, I guess the crosswalk between draft principles 2 and 3, I think we should be open to the potential of replacing an existing funding source with a new funding source or better funding source. And let me just explain a little bit my thinking. They're currently, many of our jurisdictions finance our local share out of real estate taxes, or at least property taxes overall. We should, I think, be open to at least looking at the possibility of moving that onto a new funding source, if it makes sense. So in other words, thinking about this not just as a means to get additional funding for transit, but also to look at the way we're funding transit currently and see if there might be a better way. Now, whether that's regional or, a local option thing, we probably need to think that through and talk about that. But I would encourage us to think about this as much a tax reform as additional revenue coming from these new revenue sources. So with that, Mr. Walkinshaw, go ahead.
Thank you, and agree with everything that you just said, and in fact that kind of replacement piece is what I wanted to mention. But first, just going to slide 14, I really appreciate number 1 here. I think that's been key from the beginning. It seemed like early on there was this sense from some that there would be like one regional source of revenue that could be equal across the region. That would be the dedicated source for Metro that would solve the problem. And that just never made sense for a lot of different reasons. One being just the nature of the compact. So I think this is absolutely correct. Going back to slide 13, I apologize. To Supervisor Alcorn's point, I think number three, consider the impact of the tax burden on property owners. I personally, I would strengthen that a little bit, and actually, for me as a principal, would be to reduce the pressure on local real estate taxes created by the need to fund transit, WMATA especially. I just think if we're going to be going to the public asking for support to implement new revenue sources, we got to make a credible case that it's going to actually reduce pressure long term on real estate taxes. You know, for us, when you look at the long term trends of how we currently fund our share of WMATA, the pressure on real estate taxes will become unbearable pretty quickly, even if we didn't have the shortfall that we currently have. So I would go from consider the impact, which sounds a little bit squishy to me, to reduce the pressure on. And what else was I gonna say there? Yeah, I think that's good. So that would be my feedback. But I think this is a great starting point. So thank you all.
Thank you. Mr. De Ferrante.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this is very helpful. I've been in one other coalition that really used a set of principles like this at the federal level and we went back to it again and again. And it was very, very helpful. I do think that the precise wording matters. I like reduce the pressure more than a signal that we are going to be able to necessarily reduce. I just think that's a effective way to navigate. I would love to, I think there's some education that I'll need from the Fairfax, you guys, as Fairfax leaders. And just, I think eventually before we pin on number two, I just wonder if we are at a real place where we can say that we would want to, you know, I just haven't yet envisioned that we would not have the real estate, the property tax as part of the solution. So that's an invitation for a conversation there. I thoroughly agree with your point on, I think you said, Mr. Chair, the first point you made was something about sort of the cost component of things. I know that's not, quote, a funding principle, but there are a whole lot of people who are going to argue that it is a funding principle. And so I'd rather not litigate whether it's a funding principle and just add something in there. The exact language would have to be determined. I guess the last thought that I have with respect to the metro component is the next slide, is thinking about, I cannot envision, it's not my favorite thing to think about, but we all know that regionally and locally, we're going to have to figure out a way to pay for part of this. We cannot ask, and that principle three, I'm fine with the aspirational language of at least 50%. I won't bet my future that we'll get above 50%, but I do think that it puts us in a different place if we have a principle that says, not over aggressively, but says something like regionally or locally, we have to put, for lack of a better descriptor, we have to put skin in the game, because there's no way that the state is going to do 90% of this additional. And so I'd rather draft it ourselves and be at a place of strength than not have a principle that talks about that. Now, I know the distance between Northern Virginia, and we just keep it to Virginia, but Northern Virginia regional and local is a huge can of worms. But I would like to put forward the possibility, and I'm not wedded to it. I'm happy to be dissuaded, but I would like to put forward the possibility that we ought to have a principle that says something about local or regional or local skin in the game said much more artfully.
Thank you very much, Matt. And before I call on you, Supervisor Walkinshaw, on that last point, it's a really interesting question. I think one of the other nuances here, and I welcome any other thoughts on this, is sometimes the definition of a state revenue source is a little curious. So, for example, to pay for the Silver Line stations, the state put in their revenue source, which comes from tolls paid by drivers on the Dulles Toll Road. Yeah, I guess that's a state source, but it's local folks driving on the Dulles Toll Road that are paying all of that. So I think, and I don't know if this belongs in our funding principles or not, but I think as we go into this process, let's be careful about labels. What's state, what's local, and let's consider where the money's actually coming from. Ideally, we get to a place where the state is truly doing their fair share. And Mr. DeFerente, I totally agree, and I'm open to other thoughts on how we can get there.
It's a great strategic thought, and the exact language of how we would word this would have to be carefully drawn so as not to allow that loophole if we were to choose a strategy that is more, there's a shoot for the moon and don't self-sabotage, and then there's a be hard bargainers on the principles that are your driving lines. And that's a strategic choice that perhaps Ms. Perrin-Seibert and many others who spent more time in Richmond would know. But sorry to interject there, Mr. Chair.
No, thank you. And let's go, Mr. Walkinshaw, Mr. Schneider, then Ms. Garvey.
Thank you. One other point that I wanted to just raise on the previous slide, 13. Number 4 there, I guess, I won't argue against it. I guess I'll say it's a question mark for me. Obviously, diversity of revenue sources is good and always sounds good. I guess I'm not entirely convinced that kind of a smorgasbord of revenue sources would be better than, for instance, a sales tax. And I guess I'm struggling to envision an economic situation where, if there were a recession, obviously sales tax revenues would decline, but presumably all the other revenue sources on that list would decline, whether it's a local income tax or regional highway use fee or other taxes. So I guess maybe one thing that would be instructive is to have kind of an understanding of how, and maybe this is something SJ28 will look at, the committee will look at, how do those other revenue sources, or historically, how have they been impacted by different recessions and different kinds of recessions? My sense is they would all decline, but maybe that's not the case. If there isn't any real benefit of diversity in the case of an economic downturn, to me, it seems easier and simpler if there is one option that can address the issue to, go to the public and try to sell that one option, as opposed to the 17 different taxes that we want to raise on you. So that just more of a question, I'm not opposed to the language, but it's an open question for me as to whether that's the right approach.
Thank you, Mr. Walkinshaw. Mr. Schneider.
Thank you. 2 quick questions. The first is, I think to the extent possible, Northern Virginia ought to act totally rather than sort of one jurisdiction do it one way, another jurisdiction do it another way. I think we're stronger if we reach a consensus on that. So I'm thinking that might be a policy position. Another one is that definition, and I thought the point was really well taken. We got to be careful about what we're calling state revenue sources. I think we ought to be clearer that that the 50% come from the state budget, which in essence would be a return of Northern Virginia to some of the money we're already paying the state. So I think we ought to strengthen that and make clear that what we're really talking about is the state recognizing the flow of money to it from transit here in terms of returning. And I don't know exactly how you phrase it, but you're right. Someone who said, a lot of things designated that may be enacted by the state, but the people of Northern Virginia pay. I don't think that's what we intend. So two points there. And then finally, in terms of not only talking about each of the providers, looking at more efficient service, I think we ought to be a little stronger on that and make clear that the expectation is that all these service providers are going to establish metrics which justify the increased funding, whether it's increased ridership, whatever makes the most sense. But ridership on some of these systems has come back. Some cases exceeded pre-pandemic levels, and in some cases they continue to be well below pre-pandemic levels. So I think we need something in there that makes clear that our expectation is that this money is going to generate high levels of performance. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Schneider. Ms. Garvey.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry to be late. I hope I may have missed this, but I don't think I did, listening to the discussion. I wonder if one of the principles, and this is really building on what everybody said, particularly Dave here most recently. One of the principles seems to me that those who benefit from the system pay. And then you look at who benefits. And as Dave and we always point out, it's the entire state of Virginia, because we fund the state of Virginia because of Metro. That feels like a decent principle that, anyway, I just toss it out. It's a little tricky because you have to be really clear who benefits. But just make it clear. That's a basic principle. It seems to me everybody can understand. Oh yeah, if you benefit, you ought to pay for it. Help pay for it. I like also the suggestions for putting in, making clear that it needs to be an efficient system. It needs to be effective. But I just toss that out as a sort of a basic principle that those that benefit should fund it, and that includes the entire state of Virginia. My 2 cents. Thanks.
Very good. Thank you, Ms. Garvey. Ms. Mattice, you had your hand up earlier. I didn't know if you wanted to add anything or address some of the points that were made.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And only, I think I got a clarification, but one thing I can put out there, we're all capturing these notes. I think there's a lot of really good things we'll be able to add in the recitals as well. So I just wanted to put that out there, that a lot of these sort of the rationale and justifications for things that we'll be putting in there. The question that I had was actually for Mr. Snyder, was to clarify money from the state budget. I think, are you getting at money that is generated statewide versus general fund, right? I think you had revenues that are statewide generated versus it. Okay, that's all. It's very nuanced, but I just want to make sure I got that. So thank you.
No, thank you, Ms. Mattice. Before I ask if there are any other questions or comments, or last questions or comments on all this, one other thing that I think is relevant, hasn't been mentioned, is I guess the timing of the crosswalk and the crosswalk between SJ 28 and DMV moves. That's one of the things is on my mind as we go through the next few months. My understanding is DMV Moves is having conversations, at least with WMATA, about some of those efficiency and cost issues. We'll see, when anything might come of that could be relevant to any principles that we're discussing here, or otherwise might provide some more insight into maybe even refining a little more the long-term needs, financial needs of transit that we're looking at. So I would just ask staff to look for opportunities where there could be a crosswalk and where there are synergies in the timing. And I know Mr. DeFerenti, obviously Mr. Smedberg, very active in the DMV Move side. Let's look for those opportunities to bring these discussions together. So we can basically be talking at least in the same direction in both of these forums. So, Mr. DeFerenti.
Thank you. It's a great point. I appreciate it, Mr. Chair. And the one question, I was trying to look back through the slides because we have timelines on lots of things. We don't have a precise timeline on the principles process. And I am not asking for you to share a precise timeline. I am more saying, and I have more limited experience perhaps than others on the call, but I do recall the one time that we used a principles document for a coalition of 8 national groups on education. We wordsmithed and we iteratived it, and so I'm not clear in my own mind when we would need the principles. There might be strategic benefit to having draft principles at one point and then final principles at a different point. And so I just wanted to, see if the smarter gurus have figured this out and raise it, because there's lots of other timelines. There's not a timeline on principle finalization, and I would imagine this might be a subject for a future committee meeting. And if you've got a plan or if you have thoughts, that's more what I'm thinking of than December the 16th at 4:30 p.m. or whatever,
Yeah, my immediate thought, and Ms. Mattias, I'd love to have you weigh on this as well. But my supposition here is that this is going to be a little bit of a working document, that it could ultimately be iterative, and we probably should have a working draft set of principles. Maybe we can come up with that by December, but then as we move into the process and start looking at real revenue, specific revenue sources, how if it's one or if it's more, how they fit together, how they relate to existing revenue sources, how they relate to that cost control, all those things. And frankly, I think we're going to get smarter as we get through this process. We're going to learn things, and we probably should take that opportunity to refine these principles so that we can maybe go a little bit, helping view those ultimate solutions in a more accurate light. Ms. Mattias, do you have any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. We had envisioned that this would be something that is actually being at the level of principles, high level, that we would be working through within the next month or two, with the idea that as recommendations came out from DMV Moves and or SJ28, the commission would do further resolutions on those specifics. I think strategically, I think it's important. Obviously, this is now in the public domain because we've just talked about them in this meeting. But I do think there's value in the commission starting to talk publicly about what the commission cares about. The timeline for actual approval, obviously that's got to be folks' comfort level. But I do think there's value. There's also value to staff in hearing what the commission is coalescing around, again, as we work with DMV Moves and SJ28. So whether they are draft or there's a principles now, and then there's a, endorsement or, issues on DMV Moves or SJ28, I'm happy, we're happy to defer to the leadership. I think it's very important, though, and I'm really appreciative of getting these comments out. It does help, I think, all of us sort of coalesce around something.
Yeah, I'll just jump in. My immediate thought is I think it would be helpful to maybe use these principles or shoot for a working draft in December. The one piece that we don't have that we, especially as elected officials, will be receiving is feedback, is public feedback, other stakeholder feedback. not only these principles, obviously on revenue source ideas as we go forward. I certainly would feel more comfortable giving time before finalizing even the principles. But I think we by going forward with something like this, I would feel comfortable moving it. But I'm open to my colleagues and any thoughts they have. Mr. De Ferrante, you have any?
Mr. Chair.
Someone else is piping in and I want to
Sorry,
share the air.
There we go, Mr. Smedberg.
Hey, sorry,
Hop on in
Walter.
here.
I'm on my phone. I was on my phone earlier and I just stayed on it. I don't have the raise hand function on this. I think the point you made is a very good one. I think between DMV moves, SJ 28, and also let's keep in mind the legislature. We don't know where the governor and his team or the Democratic leadership is heading as it relates to transportation or transportation funding at this point. So I think having a guiding document, a living document or iterative document with these basic principles that people can understand, I think is really important. And we be flexible as well. Because we don't know where this is leading and heading. And then we also have some question about the federal level as well at this point. So I think to your point, I think it was really well made. So yeah.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah.
Mr. De Ferrante.
Well, I just trying to take the good thoughts and offer them subject to those who know the legislature best. And it is simultaneously, this is public, however, it's a draft. I don't feel that anybody should be looking at this in preparation, well, unless staff dreams to do so, that this is something that we have to pin at our December NVTC meeting. Instead, I think sometime in December and then Paul, others will have expertise. I wonder if we have the ideas, some of these ideas that James had and that others had, we should just incorporate and try to get a next iteration. But I also am mindful that there could be reasons to finalize this when we have an august new chair in January, because we have to think about the legislature and I'm not sure that you guys would know better. I'm not sure that we have to go all into the first 3 weeks of the new session with our principles, but at least that's one thought that I have. But that's my attempt to try to put concreteness. If we had a next solid draft by December 20th, and then further finalizations in January for our commission meeting, that is still a draft that could be adjusted. That feels, I've said 10 cents rather than 2 cents, but I submit it for all of you.
Yeah, I think, Mr. Chair, if I could, I think James made some good points, as did David as well. So, yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Snyder.
Thank you. So I, in thinking about this, one of the risks is that we never get the principles out. You know what I mean? Because there's constant editing and discussion, and for very reasonable purposes, perhaps. But I would favor a shorter. Let's have the discussion in December and present a draft for final action in January. Recognizing that it is evergreen and it may evolve, but if we allow this to drag on, we will have defeated the purpose of putting the principles out. Just a thought about. Yeah, I agree that it should be December, but I think in order to make these principles play a role, we can't still be talking about them in April or May. It seems to me. Otherwise, we defeat the whole purpose. And we will have put a lot of staff time and elected official time and maybe public comment time into something that never reaches finalization. So I would favor a shorter rather than longer approach here. Draft in December, we take comments.
Yeah.
And on the basis of those comments, maybe provide an opportunity for written comments from the commission till the end of December or mid-December or whatever. But I think I favor, if we're going to do this, let's do it expeditiously so it actually plays a role in the process. Just a couple thoughts. Thanks.
Okay.
Yeah, Mr. Chair,
Ty-
totally
Yeah.
agree. And I don't think other people were suggesting, David, that be the case. I think, but having a living document, I think is
Oh, yeah.
a good idea. Yeah.
Yep. Mhm.
That's all. Yeah.
Great. Thank you for that discussion. Ms. Matthijs, does that work? Any thoughts in terms of implementation or
Yeah,
next?
thank you, Mr. Chair. And I think that we have a couple of wonderful opportunities. I think that we'll be able to bring, obviously, taking some refinement, bringing something for a conversation in December. We actually also have our annual public hearing in December, as well as public comment open for almost a month. So there's actually a really fantastic existing format for collecting public comment that we can take advantage of. That will run through end of December. So there's a couple different ways we can do that. And so that we can then have it. And again, if we look at something that's an action in January, that doesn't mean we can't have an updated or a second. Likewise, when we did this in 2017, I do believe there were several resolutions that sort of migrated depending what was going on. I like the idea of having something that's in a public domain, that it's been discussed, and that there is some general consensus within the commission. It actually becomes a very powerful tool to have a document like this approved, even if it gets modified in the coming months. So thank you.
All right, sounds good. I'm seeing some nodding heads, a thumbs up. We're not voting, but all right, lest I ruin my reputation for any sort of meeting management. Let's move on. I'm going to turn it back over to co-chair, I guess, Gary.
Thanks, Chair Alcorn. Moving on to agenda item number 5. We're going to get a refresher on our MVTC draft 2025 legislative and policy agenda. It was shared with the committee back in September and with the full commission in November, but Daniel will be providing us this brief update for the draft priorities and timeline for approval. So Daniel. We can't hear you if you're talking, Daniel.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, there you are. All right.
All right, well, thank you, Chair Gary. I will provide a brief update on the development of MVTC's 2025 legislative and policy agenda set to be approved by the commission next month. So we brought a draft agenda to this committee in December for review and made some minor tweaks to the agenda based on committee input. Since then, we also added one item to the state legislative agenda to support legislation that would exempt commuter railroads from state tax on surplus line insurance for rolling stock and railroad operating properties. That was added in support of our partners at VRE. We also brought the draft agenda to the commission at their November meeting, where several commissioners had expressed interest in ensuring legislators were provided information on cost-cutting and efficiency measures that WMATA has undertaken in recent years. So in response to that, MVTC staff are developing an issue brief separate from the 2025 legislative agenda to highlight these achievements, and that will be shared once it is finalized. We also want to close the loop on a discussion of WMATA's PREA funding that took place at the last commission meeting, as we keep an eye on the federal legislative landscape and possible future impacts to Metro. WMATA's federal PREA funding is authorized through 2031 and is subject to the annual congressional appropriations process. By statute, if WMATA's PREA funding is not authorized, the Commonwealth's PREA match would not flow to WMATA either. So next month, the commission will be asked to approve NVTC's 2025 federal and state legislative agenda. which will guide our legislative work next year. The 2025 Virginia legislative session begins on January 8th, and NVTC staff will be monitoring the General Assembly and communicating with legislators on issues impacting transit in Northern Virginia. So again, to reiterate, while we don't have a significant ask of the state legislature planned for 2025, we're gearing up for a much larger ask in 2026 once SJ28 and DOV moves wrap up their work with funding recommendations for both the Commonwealth of Virginia and larger DMV region. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Any questions from our commissioners? Oh, looks like you're getting off easy, Daniel.
Thank you.
All right. Well, if there's no other questions, we're going to move to item 6. Okay, moving to item 6. Any other topics?
I had a question. I can't
Ms.
find
Garvey.
raise hands. I'm sorry. I'm looking and looking and looking. Forget I'm just interrupting. And it's just a general, which is probably the back of all of our minds. I mean, when do we? I won't be here, but I have a feeling the landscape for funding for transportation and everything else is going to be huge, is going to be really different come February, maybe. And so I don't know, I think we probably need to continue down this track, but it feels to me like this is so pre-Trump election and the world is going to be different afterwards, and we're probably going to have to change. So I don't know that there's any, I just think to be aware of that, possibly have some thoughts about how to regroup and go over things when the landscapes change so much that the plans we've made now don't kind of work anymore. Maybe that won't happen. Maybe it won't happen, but it's probably something just to have in the back of your own minds. I won't be here, but I think things could be really different in this group. Like every other government group is going to have to be pretty agile and make some pretty quick changes and be a little prepared to do that. I don't know if that's helpful, but I toss it out there.
No, of course. I think we're going to have to be nimble on our feet. And Ms. Matthijs, if you have anything to add, I'll let you jump in a second, but I want to get Mr. Alcorn in there real fast.
Yeah, just very quickly. Yeah, it's a great point, Ms. Garvey, especially in terms of our federal legislative program. We're going to probably have to be really nimble. And then obviously we're going to have to watch out for what that's going to do to the state level as well, because it does often flow downhill. So
yeah, maybe for what it's worth, have some standing meetings set up that aren't as far out. That's just a thought. So you can always cancel them.
Yeah, we'll definitely be adjusting the game plan as we move forward, right? But Daniel or Ms. Matthijs, did you want to add anything on that? Or are you guys good?
If I could, Mr. Chair, I think adding 2 things. One thing on the federal front, I am on a legislative committee at the American Public Transportation Association. We're actually meeting in December to talk about legislative strategy at the federal space. So I'm happy to bring back my insights. That one of the things and I think I mentioned it at our November meeting, is when it comes to public transit and the infrastructure bill, there's 2 more years left on the current federal authorization. So obviously eyes are on that next authorization. So I hope to be able to provide some insights as to with changes in administration, changes in the House and Senate in that space. The other thing I did want to mention, a little bit focused on an upcoming event, is actually just remind folks that our NVTC, PRTC, and VRE Legislative Forum is coming up on Friday, December 13th at the George Mason campus in Arlington, Virginia. We are close to 200 people RSVP'd for that event, which is unprecedented in its participation. And I'd love to say, because a lot of folks are very excited to be talking about the issues of public transit. We're happy to have pretty amazing lineup. For us, we have Senator Louise Lucas is going to be coming by and saying hello to kick things off. We do have Randy Clark, Josh Baker, Bob Schneider, and Rich Dalton talking about sort of what's going on in the public transit operators space. Then we have Paul Smedberg opening up and introducing a panel that's going to be focused on what's happening with DMV moves and SJ28. Nick Donahue is going to be moderating that, and it has Senator Boysko, Senator Eben, Chair Jeff McKay, and Delegate Sickles. So we really are expecting an interesting and exciting event that Friday morning. And we do look forward to seeing everybody there. And it is open to the public. Folks just need to RSVP.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ms. Matthijs. Mr. Snyder.
I had a question going back to the discussion about the role of the federal government. Do we have anything in our draft principles that addresses that?
So remind me, Daniel, in our federal legislative space, I think right now we just want to make sure access to the existing public transit dollars and that our localities have access to those, because those continue going on. So remind me, Daniel, what we have in the federal one. I just don't have it right in front of me.
The language, Kate, that we use is fun. It's just ensuring that our local governments have access to both competitive grant and formula funding opportunities at the federal level. So it is, I think, intentionally vague in the agenda.
Most of those funds are actually guaranteed under the Federal Highway Trust Fund that is not subject to annual appropriations. And so that's there's a little bit more strength in the public transit program than there could be from the annual appropriations process.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that we don't suggest that they shouldn't be a significant partner here.
Oh, I'm so sorry, Ms. Shire. Are you talking back to the funding principles?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Ah, okay. Sorry. In fact, I apologize. I was focused on the legislative agenda. We do not currently have a reference specifically. So let's see if we can explore what that looks like.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments before we wrap it up? Libby, I was looking at you just in case, since you can't find your hand function.
I just shout at you.
And I'll just add last comment on my end. For what it's worth, I was at the National League of Cities conference this past week in Tampa, and I signed up to be on their transportation advocacy group. We're not going to find out until December, but hey, every bit counts, right? So we'll see.
It's good.
All right, so our next joint WMATA and Ledge Policy Committee meeting is scheduled for February 20th, 2025 at 6 p.m. If anything changes, we will definitely let everybody know beforehand. But other than that, I want to wish everybody a happy and healthy holiday season, because we're going to have a busy 2025. So thanks, everyone. And with that, we are adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody. Good holidays.
Take care.